This week on the Retirement Quick Tips podcast, I'm talking about America's $36 trillion tab on the national debt and what that means for you. Today, I want to talk about why the U.S. national debt is so problematic. Now, a lot of what you read or see when you see headlines or, click on YouTube videos about the national debt, I would say most of the time it is overblown clickbait. The U.S. debt situation is really complicated, and it's not the same as a household debt situation or even the debt situation of a business. So if you or I operated like the U.S. government and we spend more than we make, not just in like 1 year, but like over multiple years, decades, we have growing debt relative to income. Eventually, and it's not going to take that long, eventually you're going to hit a wall. You're going to lose your car. You're going to lose your house. You're going to file for bankruptcy. You're going to pick up the pieces and start over. But the United States government is completely different. It can and has run budget deficits where they spend more than they bring in tax revenue. And that results in ever increasing, ever growing amounts of debt. And that has continued for decades. Basically, for as long as I've been alive, we've seen the U.S. debt climb exponentially. Right now is really the first time that the U.S. debt has become a concern. So I talked earlier in the week about how in 2011, the Standard & Poor's Ratings Agency downgraded the U.S. debt. And then I think in 2013, we had the debt ceiling crisis where, if you remember, for like a week, the federal government services stopped because Congress was deadlocked over increasing the debt ceiling. And all these federal government services temporarily paused. I think it was like a week or 2 weeks or something. But there has been cracks before in the U.S. national debt situation. But the growing U.S. debt has always truly been a problem for tomorrow. But right now, what we have that is starting to become a more near-term problem is this perfect storm of a few different things that are now coming home to roost. Now, I still don't think that the national debt is going to reach crisis levels anytime soon. I think we are potentially still years away from that, but there is no political will yet to address this. So here are the few kind of problematic trends that are leading to this sort of time sensitive, no longer a problem for tomorrow. It seems more like it's a problem for today. Number one, the U.S. now pays more in interest cost on its debt than it does on national defense. This isn't just an Elon Musk Doge talking point. If you watch any of that in his press conferences in Doge, he repeatedly says this. But the fact is that this is a very important milestone. The fact that so much of the federal government's tax revenue and what it brings in on an annual basis is just going to servicing the debt, to paying interest on the existing debt. What happens there is that crowds out other spending. If we can't repair bridges or improve our military, it's because the interest cost is so high. And that hurts the economy because those dollars that are spent on the interest, they could and should be used for more productive purposes. And this couldn't come at a worse time either, because the interest costs are really high because the US has so much debt now. But that wasn't such a big problem in the low interest rate world that we were living in from basically 2009 all the way up until 2022. Rates were very, very low following the global financial crisis, and they stayed that way up until inflation hit hard after COVID. Inflation, though, threw all of that out the window because U.S. Treasury debt, they could issue treasuries and pay you like 2% on a 10-year treasury bond, and people would buy that. But in the higher interest rate world that we now live in, now we're looking at 4-5% rates. And so the government interest costs are exploding because interest rates are higher at the exact same time that the debt has never been higher. And so this creates a pretty bad debt spiral because they're going to have to pay higher and higher interest rates on new debt just to attract the buyers. And then you have the recent credit downgrade by ratings agencies, like was recently in the news with Moody's, downgraded US debt. That further increases the borrowing costs of the government. It's similar to like a credit score. If you have a perfect 800 plus credit score, you're going to be able to borrow at lower rates. If your credit is downgraded because you have certain dings on your credit, then you're going to have to finance that new car or whatever debt you want to get at higher rates. You're going to pay a higher rate because you have lower credit quality and lower probability that you're going to pay back compared to the perfect 800 plus score credit rating. Well, the Moody's downgrade is the same way. It results in further increases to borrowing costs that the government pays on their debt because it doesn't have that sterling AAA credit rating anymore. So when you have more and more money just going to pay the interest on the current and new debts, the government has 3 options, none of which are good for anyone, especially retirees. So they can issue more debt. That's what they've been doing. By the way, I'm going to talk about all of these at length tomorrow because we do need to explore all 3 of these options and what that means for you as the government tries to kind of navigate its way out of this growing debt problem. Okay, so they can issue more debt. That's been what they've been doing for the last 40 years. Politically, it is the easy way out. They can increase taxes. In other words, bring in more revenue, which would help pay down the debt. That doesn't sound very great, does it? No. And then they can reduce spending. So they can reduce outlays. Now, that's also problematic because if you look at what the government primarily spends money on, Social Security, Medicare, defense, interest cost, okay, that goes back to issuing more debt. That's like more than half of federal government spending just in those areas. So cutting some little program, preschool for all or paid maternity leave or something, that's a drop in the bucket. And that's part of the reason why the DOGE project has had disappointing results, because until you tackle the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is Social Security, Medicare, higher entitlement spending, until you tackle those areas, you're just not going to have a meaningful reduction in spending that's going to result in the need to issue a lot less debt or not as much debt anymore. So anyways, I'll talk more about these options tomorrow, how they could impact you. But for now, those are kind of the 3 options that the government can take in order to improve the growing debt situation. All right, that's it for today. Thank you for listening. My name is Ashley Michike, and this is the Retirement Quick Tips Podcast.